Okay, we've done our pen and wash in using quill and bamboo. We've also done it in fountain pen and wash. This time we're going to be using dip pens. And this is a classic image that can be done in this way, but specific difference is that instead of using ink, we're going to be using watercolour as our ink using the dip pen. Now when we consider the actual nibs for dip pen work, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, a bewildering array in fact, varying in flexibility and widths, from very sharp pointed to quite rounded. This gives you an indication of some of the types that are available, and here we have quite a collection of the variety. And with those come the holders, and here I've got a little selection. What you tend to do is, depending on how heavy-handed you are, you will go for a more or less flexible nib. And furthermore, if you want to do very fine lines, you can go for extra fine tips or slightly more rounded, pointed tips, like so. And here I have what I call a preliminary sketch, or refer to often in the trade as a thumbnail sketch, just a small indication of what the final image is going to look like. From this, I then produce my larger drawing version, which will be like so. Broadly speaking, the image is a range of trees, sky backdrop, fields, and some scrub hedge in the front foreground. The light is from the left, and it causes wonderful long shadows to come across the field here, which is the purpose of the image. What I want to do is to mask out a little circle for where the sun's going to be. And for that I'm going to use a little bit of masking tape, like so. Okay, I'm just use my little compass cutter to cut out a disc of masking tape, which I'm going to use to act as a very white space in low down where the position of the sun would be, like so. Right, now's the time for the wash, and I'm going to wet the paper first, as we're going to sort of wet into a wet approach. And I'm using this little atomizer, actually it's not so little, like so. I want it fairly random, don't want to get overly detailed with it. And around the sun we're going to be using a mixture of raw sienna and permanent rose. The raw sienna gives it that sort of instant sunshine feel. And then that will let that gradually merge into blue, which is using a phthalo blue. Again, I'm going to mix that with a little bit of the permanent rose, just to make it slightly more violety. Darken up over. You see the whole thing's being very broad. I'm going to use a even bigger brush now, because I want this dark zone against the light tree. I'm not leaving the light tree out, because that's going to be done in another technique. So this is the indigo, slightly stormy sky, because it's a frosty morning. I'm trying to depict, so there's a bit of indigo, so even darker. And then very palely run this soft white colour through, like so, indicating the shadows, albeit very slightly. Now I'm using a tissue to drain off surplus juice, like so. And then we'll let that sunlight melt through the trees, like so. You don't want great gouts of water or puddles of water hanging about, otherwise what tends to happen is that those will turn into cauliflowers. If you're going to have cauliflowers, have them up in amongst the trees. It looks more like foliage that way. Okay, so now what I can do is to lift off the masking tape for the sun, and it'll give you an idea of what we have left behind. Like so. Now in there is some of the branches of the tree, so I'm going to carefully just erase those. What I want to put in some like more of a sunshiny colour today. Okay, so this is the pen I'm going to be using. It's a slightly stiffer one, in fact it's very much stiffer, with a smoothish tip, but still fairly fine. So I can go from quite thick tree trunks to the finer branches. And then the brush I'm using here is a filbert sable, which I shall use for loading the pen. This is burnt sienna, which is the colour I'm going to start with, so it'll have the redness of the sun coming through the branches, and as you can see, literally paint it on to the tip like so. And I want to check that it's going to work, so I can use my little sketch here to see if it's going to. Yep, there we go. And still it's a little bit more encouragement. Yep, there we are. It's lovely, very quick, easy to put on. Usually when you mix the colour, you'll be surprised, it will probably look darker when it's put on than you think when it's on the pen itself. Well, it looks quite light. Mainly that's because you're scratching the surface of the paper. Right, so here we go. Surprisingly, actually, how quickly it goes when you're enjoying yourself. Okay, so a little bit more growthily in there. Now, as the trees move further out of the corollary of the sun, the branches will appear much darker. Also, with watercolour, you tend to work from quite pale to much darker, and sometimes, if you're not careful, you can actually get it too dark too soon. Now introduce some further colour into the branches by using cadmium red and cadmium yellow to give me a genuine orange. Painting with the brush. That'll mix a little bit with the other colour, which is not a bad thing. And put in all these slightly orangier lines. Okay. So that is almost there, ready for the next wash. I want to put the wet paint on, but I'm going to get joints if I'm not careful, so I need to wet the zones very carefully first. This dripping won't matter at all. So just do that, just to show you, look, that the penwork isn't moving. In other words, it's not bleeding. So I'm going to really beef this up a bit. Like so. Look at that. That really is a frosty tree. I will do a bit of frosty tree there as well. Now then, we've got to grade that into the rest of the sky without panicking. So you can always imagine this is a bit like rain if necessary, so you can just take it across like so. Just wipe that out like so. Okay, so I'm going to apply the wash to the foreground, well, the nearer field. And what we've got is an interesting phenomenon. We've got the sun casting shadow from this hedge to quite a substantial part of the field. So this is going to be quite simple. But then you have these wonderful lines coming as shadows from the trees, which I've got to make sure, A, radiating from the sun, but also showing up the contours of the land, which is a particularly exciting phenomenon. I'm using a mixture of indigo and perylene green, which is particularly dark. I've loaded my hake up with it. Now this is dipping away slightly from the tree line, so as we can. Now all sorts of weird things will happen and you'll probably start to panic. That's why I like to keep quite broad at this stage, because there's lots of things you can do at the latter stage to rectify. The one thing you don't want to do is panic. If you want to erase locally, you can use a small brush like this and just tease the edge there like that. This is a cut down fan brush, ideal for this sort of job. Okay, so now we can go back to some pen work, and I want to do a whole lot here, but before I do that, I've got my fence post, which is going to be a bit of, man-made heavy duty, and this which will be quite useful to create a bit of interest. It's got some barbed wire wrapped round it, or should we just say wire? A bit of brown to there. Now as the foliage comes in front of it, you need to negative paint so it's not just a hard line right the way through. This is a kind of bit of calligraphy fun really, where we're going to be doing things like leaves. Now I can afford to cheat here because what I'm going to be doing as we go is adding some little dots of white and so on, white gouache, which will help to, that's quite nice when you get a bit of brrr growing off your post. Adds a little extra je ne sais quoi to the image. Stuff tangles and tangles around. So again, like with the trees, this is slightly different because it's more towards the foreground, and so therefore you can afford to show those kind of intricacies, like so. It's quite nice when you go across things in the background. Helps to increase the depth in the image rather than just going up to it or some such. Well, I think I've dealt with most of the darker tones, so what I want to do now is to work on some opaque pigment, in other words to pick out some lights. And this you can do with your pen and wash system if you're using watercolour, except in this instance to create the light tones I'm going to be using some white designer's gouache. It's called permanent white and it's actually ideal for this job. So we get that onto there. Make sure our brush is clean, albeit in dirty water. And a little water. Now I'm going to use the sort of orangey colour that we've had for the trees to start with. So I want to stick some of this in amongst this foliage. So just paint it onto the tip, just like you would with any other colour. Just make sure that the little hole is covered over as well. And if you've got little blots and awkward shape, like here for example, branches, just go across those and suddenly it ain't so clumsy. And you can do little flickering strokes as well to get the idea of the light flickering through the branches. So down here for example, quite nice. Now then here we're going to put in a lot more, particularly on this top edge where we get the feeling of the sun kissing the top of the branches. Okay, so we're just adding a little more light tone to some of these branches so that they blend a little more. In fact, we're pretty much there. But what I want to do is to introduce some texture into the grass, etc. in the foreground here, just to create a little bit of je ne sais quoi. So we've got some parallel lines, but squiggly, and that's just to increase the textures. And then I shall probably finish off with a few fine white dots as well. Helps to make it a bit of additional realism, do a little bit of intentional splatter. Okay, so that'll do for that. Now we're going to get my splatter brush, it's this chap, and with a little bit of pale photo. Okay, so that leaves one final job. And et voila!